Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Have you ever wondered how a people can live on the same land for centuries, planting crops, building towns, raising families, and yet within a single generation find themselves ordered to leave it behind forever? Across the green hills and wide valleys of the southeastern United States, long before highways and cities appeared, a nation already lived there. Fields of corn and beans grew in careful rows. Townhouses gathered around council grounds. Rivers carried canoes between settlements. In these places, the Cherokee people had built a society that was both ancient and evolving, rooted deeply in the land that surrounded them. Yet during the early 19th century, a series of political decisions, economic pressures, and expanding ambitions in the young United States slowly brought that long presence into question. Tonight's story follows that turning point. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And wherever you're listening from tonight, feel free to share your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where in the world these quiet history journeys are reaching. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the early decades of the 19th century, the southeastern corner of North America held a landscape that felt both settled and expansive. Rolling forests stretched across what would later become states such as Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and North Carolina. Rivers wound through valleys, providing fertile soil for farms and reliable routes for travel. Small towns stood beside clear streams, and cultivated fields spread outward from them. Within this region lived the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee people had occupied these lands for generations beyond written record. Their towns were often built near water, with clusters of homes arranged around central meeting places where community decisions were discussed. Agriculture formed the foundation of daily life. Corn, beans, and squash grew in carefully tended fields, while hunting and fishing provided additional food throughout the year. Families organized their lives around extended kinship networks. Children learned practical skills from parents and elders: how to plant crops, how to preserve food, how to understand the rhythms of the seasons that shaped farming and travel alike. Leadership within the Cherokee Nation developed through councils that represented different towns and regions. Decisions affecting the whole nation required careful discussion and agreement among leaders. This system encouraged balance between local communities and the broader political structure that connected them. By the early 1800s, the Cherokee Nation had also begun adapting to new influences brought by increasing contact with the United States. European-American traders and settlers had lived near Cherokee lands for many decades. Trade routes passed through Cherokee territory, carrying goods such as metal tools, cloth, and livestock. Over time, some Cherokee communities incorporated these items into everyday life. Farm practices changed gradually. Some Cherokee farmers began raising cattle and cultivating larger fields similar to neighboring American farms. Written language also became part of Cherokee life after the creation of a unique writing system. This writing system came from the work of Sequoyah. Sequoyah believed that spoken Cherokee could be represented with written symbols. Over several years he developed a syllabary, a system in which each symbol represented a sound. Once introduced, it spread quickly throughout Cherokee communities. Within a short time, many Cherokee citizens were able to read and write in their own language. Printed materials soon followed. Newspapers and documents appeared in Cherokee script. Written communication allowed leaders to record laws, share news between towns, and strengthen connections across the nation. Political organization also evolved. In 1827, the Cherokee Nation adopted a written constitution that established a structured government with executive, legislative, and judicial branches. This system reflected elements of the United States government, but remained rooted in Cherokee traditions of collective leadership. At the center of this new political structure stood Principal Chief John Ross. John Ross was born in 1,790 inches, what is now Alabama. His background reflected the cultural complexity of the region. His father was of Scottish descent, while his mother came from a Cherokee family with deep connections to the nation. Ross grew up speaking Cherokee and participating fully in Cherokee society. As an adult, he became one of the most prominent political leaders of the Cherokee Nation. Ross believed strongly that the Cherokee people could remain on their ancestral lands while maintaining peaceful relations with the United States. He worked through diplomacy, petitions, and legal arguments to defend Cherokee sovereignty. At the same time, the world around the Cherokee Nation was changing rapidly. The United States had gained independence only a few decades earlier, yet its population was already expanding westward at remarkable speed. New states formed as settlers moved into lands that had once been considered distant frontiers. In the southeast, cotton agriculture transformed the economy. Cotton became one of the most profitable crops in the world during the early 19th century. Large plantations spread across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. This growth required land, large amounts of it. American settlers increasingly looked toward territories still occupied by native nations. The fertile valleys and forests of Cherokee country became especially attractive to those seeking new farms and opportunities. Pressure began quietly at first. Individual settlers sometimes crossed into Cherokee territory, establishing farms without official permission. State governments occasionally passed laws claiming authority over native lands within their borders. For many years, the United States government had recognized the Cherokee Nation as a separate political entity through treaties. These agreements acknowledged Cherokee ownership of their lands and promised federal protection. Yet the tension between treaty promises and expanding settlement continued to grow. By the 1820s, the Cherokee Nation stood at a crossroads between two powerful forces. On one side was the determination of Cherokee leaders to preserve their homeland and political independence. They had adopted written laws, developed schools, printed newspapers, and demonstrated that their nation could function alongside the United States as a distinct society. On the other side stood the ambitions of a rapidly expanding country whose citizens increasingly desired the same land the Cherokee people called home. For many American settlers, Cherokee territory appeared as open land waiting to be claimed. The presence of towns, farms, and governments already established there often went unrecognized or was deliberately overlooked. Political debates in Washington, D.C., began addressing the question more directly. Some American leaders believed native nations should remain where they were and continue developing their societies alongside the United States. Others argued that removal to lands west of the Mississippi River would prevent future conflicts between native communities and settlers. The idea of relocation gradually gained support among influential politicians. Advocates claimed that moving native nations westward would protect them from encroaching settlers while opening southeastern land for American expansion. Critics warned that such policies would ignore existing treaties and force native people from lands they had long occupied. For the Cherokee Nation, these debates carried enormous consequences. Leaders such as John Ross continued to argue that Cherokee citizens had every right to remain where they were. Their nation had signed treaties, built towns, and developed systems of law recognized by the United States itself. They believed that honoring those agreements would allow both societies to coexist. Yet, events beyond Cherokee control were already gathering momentum. New settlers continued arriving in nearby states. Political leaders increasingly spoke of removal as a practical solution to growing tensions. Newspapers printed editorials discussing the future of native nations in the Southeast. The Cherokee people watched these developments carefully. For many families living in towns across their homeland, daily life still followed familiar rhythms. Fields were planted in the spring. Harvests filled storage houses in autumn. Councils met to discuss laws and trade. Children learned to read Cherokee, writing in schools that had appeared in several communities. At the same time, uncertainty slowly entered conversations across the nation. Would treaties continue to protect their land? Would the United States government stand by its earlier agreements? Or would the expanding population of American settlers eventually reshape the future of Cherokee country? No single moment provided the answer. Instead, a series of decisions, political, economic, and legal, would gradually lead toward one of the most difficult chapters in American and Cherokee history. The story that follows unfolds across several years in the 1830s. It involves presidents and lawmakers in Washington, state governments in the Southeast, and thousands of Cherokee citizens whose lives would soon be changed by forces far beyond their control. At the center of it all stands the question first asked tonight: how can a homeland, occupied and cultivated for generations, suddenly become a place people are ordered to leave behind? The answer would take shape through events that unfolded step by step across a changing nation. The Cherokee Nation in the early 19th century occupied a wide and varied landscape across the southern Appalachian region. Their territory stretched across the mountains and valleys that would later become parts of Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama. The terrain was not uniform. Some areas were dense with forest, while others opened into fertile valleys where rivers curved slowly through farmland. This geography shaped how Cherokee communities organized their lives. Many Cherokee towns developed along rivers or creeks where fresh water was reliable and transportation by canoe remained possible. Paths connected these settlements through the woods, forming a network of travel routes used for trade, diplomacy, and visits between families. Over time, these routes became familiar corridors across the country, allowing communication between distant communities. Cherokee towns were often arranged around central gathering places. These areas were used for council meetings, public discussions, and seasonal ceremonies. Buildings were constructed from materials readily available in the surrounding forests. Wooden frames were covered with clay or bark, creating homes that remained cool in summer and warm during colder months. Families often lived near relatives, forming clusters of households that strengthened ties within each community. Agriculture formed the foundation of Cherokee daily life. Fields were cleared carefully from nearby woodland and cultivated through the changing seasons. Corn remained the most important crop, serving as the basis of many foods prepared throughout the year. Beans and squash grew alongside it, and together these crops provided reliable nourishment for households across the nation. Cherokee farmers understood the rhythms of the land. Planting and harvesting followed patterns shaped by generations of observation. Families stored food carefully to prepare for winter months, using drying and preservation methods that allowed crops to last through colder seasons. Hunting continued to play a role in Cherokee society as well. Deer, turkey, and other animals from the surrounding forests provided meat, clothing materials, and trade goods. Skilled hunters moved through the woods with deep knowledge of animal behavior and seasonal movement. Fishing added another layer to this system. Rivers and streams supported fish populations that could be caught using nets, spears, or traps designed for local waters. These varied food sources allowed Cherokee communities to maintain stable populations across their territory. Daily life also included crafts and trade. Cherokee artisans produced pottery, woven baskets, and carved tools that served both practical and cultural purposes. These items were often exchanged between towns or traded with neighboring groups. Contact with European American traders had introduced new goods into Cherokee markets. Metal tools gradually replaced some traditional stone implements. Iron cooking pots appeared in homes. Cloth fabrics became available through trade networks that connected Cherokee towns to nearby American settlements. These exchanges did not erase Cherokee traditions. Instead, communities incorporated useful items while continuing established practices that had long defined Cherokee life. Political organization connected these many towns into a broader national structure. Councils composed of respected leaders from different communities met to discuss matters affecting the entire nation. Decisions required careful discussion, and consensus remained an important part of governance. This political system evolved during the early 19th century as the Cherokee Nation responded to increasing interaction with the United States. Leaders recognized that written laws and formal institutions could strengthen their ability to communicate with American officials. In 1827, the Cherokee Nation adopted a written constitution that outlined a centralized government structure. This constitution created 3 branches of government, including an executive led by a principal chief, a national council responsible for legislation, and a judicial system to interpret laws. The design drew inspiration from the United States government, but was adapted to Cherokee traditions of collective leadership. At the center of this political system stood Principal Chief John Ross. Ross spent many years representing Cherokee interests in negotiations with the United States government. He believed that strengthening Cherokee institutions would demonstrate that the nation deserved recognition as a sovereign political community. Education became another focus of Cherokee development during this period. Mission schools had begun operating in some Cherokee towns, introducing reading and writing to younger generations. These schools taught both Cherokee syllabary and English, creating opportunities for students to communicate across cultural boundaries. The Cherokee syllabary itself remained one of the most remarkable developments in the nation's history. Its creator, Sequoyah, had worked for years to develop written symbols representing the sounds of spoken Cherokee. Once the system spread through the nation, literacy increased rapidly. Many Cherokee citizens became able to read and write in their own language within a short period of time. The spread of literacy led to the creation of the Cherokee Phoenix, a newspaper printed in both Cherokee and English. Published in the late 1820s, it carried news, legal notices, and discussions about events affecting the Cherokee Nation. Through this newspaper, leaders communicated decisions and shared information across communities. It also served as a way to explain Cherokee perspectives to readers beyond their territory. Religious life in the Cherokee Nation reflected both older traditions and newer influences. Ceremonies connected to seasonal cycles remained important in many towns. These gatherings reinforced relationships between families and communities while marking changes in the agricultural year. At the same time, some Cherokee citizens adopted Christian practices introduced by missionaries who lived among the towns. Churches appeared in certain areas, and ministers sometimes served as teachers in mission schools. The presence of different beliefs did not necessarily divide communities. Many families navigated these changes by blending traditions in ways that suited their lives. Economically, the Cherokee Nation had become increasingly connected to regional markets. Farmers sold surplus crops to nearby American settlements. Livestock such as cattle and horses became part of agricultural life. Some Cherokee citizens operated mills or trading posts that served both Cherokee and non-Cherokee customers. Roads passing through Cherokee territory carried wagons transporting goods between states. Inns and small stores occasionally appeared along these routes, serving travelers moving across the region. These developments demonstrated that Cherokee society was not isolated. Instead, it participated actively in the broader economic world of the southeastern United States. Despite these connections, the Cherokee Nation maintained its own laws and territorial boundaries. Treaties signed with the United States government had recognized Cherokee ownership of their lands. These agreements promised protection from encroachment by settlers and affirmed that Cherokee territory would remain under the authority of the Cherokee Nation itself. However, conditions around the Cherokee homeland were changing. Population growth in neighboring states continued to increase pressure on available land. American settlers moving westward often viewed native territories as obstacles to expansion rather than established homelands with legal protections. State governments began passing laws claiming authority over native lands within their borders. These laws sometimes attempted to extend state jurisdiction into Cherokee territory, challenging the agreements previously made between the Cherokee Nation and the federal government. For Cherokee leaders, these developments raised serious concerns. They believed treaties signed with the United States should protect their sovereignty and territory. If those agreements could be ignored or overridden by state governments, the legal foundation of their nation would be weakened. Throughout the 1820s, Cherokee representatives traveled repeatedly to Washington, D.C. to present their arguments. They submitted petitions explaining that their nation had adopted written laws, organized schools, and developed institutions that demonstrated stability and governance. Their goal was not confrontation but recognition. Cherokee leaders hoped that by showing their commitment to law and order, they could maintain peaceful coexistence with the expanding United States. Meanwhile, Daily life within Cherokee towns continued much as it had before. Families planted crops in the spring and gathered harvests in autumn. Children attended school or learned practical skills from parents and elders. Councils met regularly to address community matters. Yet beyond the boundaries of Cherokee country, political conversations were shifting. New voices began calling for a different approach to the relationship between native nations and the United States. Some American leaders argued that removing native communities west of the Mississippi River would eliminate disputes over land ownership. Supporters of this idea believed that relocation could open southeastern lands for settlement, while relocating native nations to areas where they would face less pressure from American expansion. Others disagreed with this proposal, pointing to treaties that had guaranteed native land rights. For the Cherokee Nation, these debates represented more than political theory. They concerned the future of homes, farms, and communities built over generations. As the decade progressed, events outside Cherokee control would begin shaping decisions that affected every town across their homeland. The Cherokee people had built a nation rooted deeply in the landscape of the southern Appalachians. Their society combined long-standing traditions with new forms of education, government, and communication. Yet the stability of that world would soon face increasing challenges. The growing desire for land among American settlers, combined with political decisions in Washington and state capitals, would gradually move the Cherokee Nation toward a moment when its future would be debated far beyond its own council grounds. During the late 1820s and early 1830s, the political atmosphere in the United States grew steadily more focused on the question of land in the southeastern states. Population growth continued at a remarkable pace. Farmers moved south and west in search of fertile soil, and state governments looked for ways to expand their authority over territories that remained outside their direct control. In Washington, D.C., discussions about native nations had become part of broader debates about expansion. The young country still carried the memory of its colonial past, yet it was already moving toward a continental future. Leaders believed the United States would continue spreading westward across the North American continent. Within this vision, native nations occupying large regions of land in the southeast were increasingly viewed as barriers to that expansion. The Cherokee Nation found itself at the center of this growing discussion. By the end of the 1820s, Cherokee territory lay surrounded by American states whose populations were rising quickly. Georgia, in particular, had a strong interest in lands held by the Cherokee people within its borders. State officials argued that these lands should come under Georgia's authority, despite earlier treaties recognizing Cherokee sovereignty. These political pressures were not limited to Georgia alone. Across the South, settlers saw Cherokee territory as land that might eventually become farmland, towns, and plantations. Cotton had become one of the most profitable crops in the global economy, and the rich soil of the southeastern hills and valleys seemed well suited to its cultivation. At the same time, political leadership in the United States was changing. In 1828, the American electorate chose a new president, Andrew Jackson. Jackson had spent much of his earlier life on the American frontier. As a military officer and public figure, he had gained national recognition through his role in several conflicts involving native nations in the Southeast. His experiences shaped how he viewed relations between the United States and native communities. Jackson believed that the continued presence of native nations inside state boundaries created ongoing conflict between settlers and indigenous populations. In his view, relocating native nations west of the Mississippi River would prevent future disputes and allow American expansion to proceed more smoothly. Supporters of this idea described relocation as a practical solution. They argued that moving native communities westward would protect them from the growing pressure of settlers while giving the United States access to land desired by its citizens. Opponents saw the issue differently. Many critics pointed out that treaties between the United States and native nations had recognized native land ownership. Forcing relocation would break those agreements and disrupt societies that had lived on their lands for generations. These arguments unfolded inside Congress, newspapers, and public discussions across the country. For the Cherokee Nation, the situation carried enormous weight. Cherokee leaders had worked for years to demonstrate that their nation could coexist peacefully with the United States. Their written constitution established government institutions, schools, and printed newspaper were intended to show that Cherokee society was organized, stable, and capable of governing itself. Principal Chief John Ross remained deeply involved in efforts to defend Cherokee sovereignty. Ross and other leaders believed the legal agreements between the Cherokee Nation and the United States should continue protecting their homeland. Petitions sent to Washington explained that Cherokee citizens were farmers, educators, craftsmen, and leaders who had built communities across their territory. They requested that the federal government uphold the treaties that had promised security for Cherokee land. While these appeals were underway, events within the Cherokee homeland added new urgency to the situation. In 1828, gold was discovered in the mountains of northern Georgia. The discovery occurred inside territory that the Cherokee Nation still considered its own. News of gold spread quickly through nearby towns and settlements. Within a short time, thousands of prospectors traveled into the region hoping to find their own fortunes. This movement of prospectors marked the beginning of what became known as the Georgia Gold Rush. Temporary camps appeared near streams and hills where miners searched for deposits of gold, roads filled with wagons carrying supplies and hopeful prospectors. Local populations increased almost overnight as new arrivals flooded into the area. For the Cherokee Nation, the gold discovery created a difficult situation. Although Cherokee laws still governed their territory, the sudden influx of outsiders placed pressure on their ability to control events within their own land. Prospectors often ignored Cherokee authority, establishing mining operations without permission. Georgia state officials responded by asserting their own control over the region. New state laws attempted to extend Georgia's jurisdiction into Cherokee territory. These laws limited the Cherokee Nation's ability to enforce its own legal system. At the same time, they encouraged American settlers and miners to remain in the region despite Cherokee protests. For many Cherokee families living in northern towns, the changes were immediate. Areas that had once been quiet farmland now saw increased traffic from miners and traders. Forest paths filled with strangers traveling in search of gold. Some mining camps appeared near Cherokee communities, bringing unfamiliar activity into previously peaceful surroundings. Cherokee leaders protested these developments, explaining that the territory still belonged to their nation under federal treaties. However, state officials continued enforcing their new laws. The tension between state authority and Cherokee sovereignty soon reached the national stage. President Andrew Jackson and many members of Congress supported a broader policy that would address similar conflicts across the Southeast. Their proposal involved relocating native nations from eastern lands to territories west of the Mississippi River. Supporters believed this approach would remove native communities from areas experiencing heavy settlement, while providing them with new land in the west where they could govern themselves without interference from state governments. Opponents warned that such relocation would involve forcing thousands of people from homes they had occupied for generations. Despite these concerns, the political momentum behind removal continued to grow. In 1830, Congress debated a bill that would become one of the most significant pieces of legislation affecting native nations in the United States. The proposal authorized the president to negotiate treaties, exchanging native lands in the east for lands in the west. While the language of the bill spoke of voluntary agreements, its supporters clearly intended it to encourage widespread relocation. After extensive debate, Congress passed the measure. The law became known as the Indian Removal Act. For supporters of removal, the act represented a solution to ongoing disputes between states and native nations. For critics, it raised serious questions about the future of treaty obligations and native sovereignty. Within the Cherokee Nation, news of the act spread quickly through towns and villages. Leaders gathered to discuss what it might mean for their people. Many believed the Cherokee Nation should resist any attempt to remove them from their homeland. They pointed again to existing treaties guaranteeing their right to remain on their land. Principal Chief John Ross prepared new petitions and diplomatic efforts aimed at protecting Cherokee territory. These appeals emphasized that the Cherokee Nation had worked carefully to build institutions recognized by the United States itself. Yet even as these efforts continued, the political environment surrounding Cherokee lands remained unsettled. Georgia state authorities persisted in enforcing their laws within Cherokee territory. Prospectors continued searching for gold in northern Georgia. American settlers remained interested in acquiring land across the region. The Cherokee Nation stood in the middle of these competing pressures. Its leaders believed the law and treaties would ultimately protect their homeland, but the political winds moving through Washington and the southern states suggested that the coming years might bring decisions with far-reaching consequences. The question of Cherokee land ownership had moved beyond local disputes. It had become part of a larger national conversation about expansion, sovereignty, and the future of native nations in the United States. Those conversations would soon move into courtrooms, legislative halls, and council meetings across the country. And with each new decision, the path ahead for the Cherokee people would become clearer, though not necessarily easier. The discovery of gold in the mountains of northern Georgia in 1828 altered the pace of events within Cherokee territory. Until that moment, debates about land and sovereignty had largely unfolded through political arguments and legal disputes. Gold brought a different kind of pressure. It attracted thousands of individuals whose primary interest was immediate opportunity rather than long negotiations over treaties. The first reports of gold appeared quietly, circulating among local settlers and traders. Small groups of prospectors began searching streams and hillsides within the region. As pieces of gold were found in riverbeds and shallow soil, word spread quickly across Georgia and neighboring states. Within months, miners began arriving in much larger numbers. Many traveled with basic tools and supplies, hoping to discover deposits that would change their fortunes. Temporary camps formed along creeks and forest clearings. Wagons carrying food, mining equipment, and trade goods rolled along rough roads into the mountains. The area soon became the center of what historians later called the Georgia Gold Rush. Unlike the later gold rush in California, this rush unfolded within territory already occupied and governed by the Cherokee Nation. Cherokee towns had long existed in these mountain valleys. Families farmed nearby fields, and community life followed familiar rhythms shaped by generations of settlement. The sudden arrival of miners disrupted that balance. Prospectors sometimes ignored Cherokee authority entirely. They established mining operations near streams, cleared land for camps, and dug shallow pits in hillsides where they believed gold might be found. Because many miners came from outside Cherokee territory, they often viewed the region simply as open land containing valuable resources. For Cherokee communities living nearby, the changes were visible and immediate. Paths that once carried travelers between towns began filling with unfamiliar wagons. Streams used for fishing and household water now hosted groups of miners sifting gravel in search of gold. Camps produced constant noise from digging, hammering, and conversation among strangers who had recently arrived. The Cherokee Nation attempted to respond through its legal system. Cherokee law required that outsiders receive permission before using land or resources within Cherokee territory. Leaders reminded miners that the land remained under Cherokee jurisdiction, according to treaties with the United States. Yet enforcing those laws became increasingly difficult. The growing number of miners overwhelmed local authority. Many prospectors ignored Cherokee warnings, believing that state governments would eventually support their presence. Georgia officials soon became deeply involved. State leaders argued that Cherokee land within Georgia should fall under the authority of the state itself. They passed laws extending Georgia's jurisdiction into Cherokee territory, challenging the agreements previously made between the Cherokee Nation and the federal government. These laws declared that Georgia courts, not Cherokee courts, would handle legal matters inside the territory. The Cherokee Nation protested these measures immediately. Leaders argued that Georgia had no legal right to impose its authority over Cherokee land. Treaties signed with the United States recognized Cherokee sovereignty and guaranteed protection from interference by individual states. However, Georgia officials continued enforcing their policies. surveyors began mapping Cherokee land for possible distribution to settlers. In some areas, lotteries were proposed that would divide land into parcels for American citizens. These plans assumed that Cherokee territory would soon become part of Georgia, despite the objections of the Cherokee government. For families living in Cherokee towns, these developments created growing uncertainty. Farmers continued tending crops as they had for years, yet rumors circulated about possible changes to land ownership. Council meetings discussed legal strategies and diplomatic appeals aimed at protecting Cherokee territory. Principal Chief John Ross remained active in defending Cherokee rights. Ross believed that the strongest path forward lay through legal arguments based on treaties and constitutional principles. He and other Cherokee representatives prepared petitions explaining that the Cherokee Nation functioned as a distinct political community. They emphasized that Cherokee citizens had adopted a written constitution, established schools, and organized a structured government. Their goal was to demonstrate that the Cherokee Nation deserved recognition as a sovereign nation rather than a population subject to state control. Meanwhile, conditions on the ground in northern Georgia continued evolving. Mining activity expanded rapidly during the early years of the gold rush. Small settlements appeared near productive streams, offering supplies and services to prospectors. Roads became busier as merchants traveled into the region carrying food, tools, and equipment. Some Cherokee citizens also participated in mining activities. Gold found within Cherokee territory technically belonged to the Cherokee Nation, and certain communities attempted to regulate mining operations under Cherokee law, yet the overwhelming number of outsiders made consistent regulation difficult. As miners moved deeper into the mountains, environmental changes became visible. Hillsides were cleared for camps. Streams were disturbed by digging and washing operations. Trails widened into rough roads capable of supporting wagons carrying mining supplies. The presence of so many outsiders also created new tensions. Disputes occasionally arose between miners and Cherokee residents regarding land use or property rights. Because Georgia had declared its own jurisdiction over the region, legal authority became increasingly unclear. At the national level, these developments strengthened arguments made by supporters of removal. Many American politicians claimed that the continued presence of native nations inside state borders would inevitably lead to conflict between settlers and indigenous communities. They argued that relocating native nations west of the Mississippi River would eliminate such disputes by separating the two populations. President Andrew Jackson supported this viewpoint. Jackson believed that removal offered what he considered a practical solution. By encouraging native nations to relocate to western lands, the federal government could open southeastern territories to American settlement while relocating native communities to regions where they would not face the same pressure from expanding populations. Critics of this policy continued to raise objections. Some members of Congress and religious leaders argued that forced relocation would violate treaties and disrupt established societies. They pointed out that the Cherokee Nation had demonstrated its willingness to adopt institutions recognized by the United States. Nevertheless, the combination of gold discovery, state legislation, and national political support for removal created a powerful momentum. Within Cherokee territory, the effects of that momentum were becoming increasingly visible. Cherokee towns continued their daily routines. Children attended schools established within the nation. Farmers planted crops in the same fields their families had worked for years. Council meetings discussed legal strategies and diplomatic missions. At the same time, surveyors from Georgia mapped Cherokee land as though it were already destined for redistribution. Mining camps expanded across the mountains. And political debates in Washington focused more intensely on policies that could reshape the future of native nations in the southeastern United States. The discovery of gold had accelerated the pace of change. What had once been a slow debate about sovereignty and treaties was now intertwined with economic opportunity, state authority, and the ambitions of thousands of settlers seeking land or wealth. For the Cherokee people, the question of their homeland was no longer confined to legal documents or diplomatic conversations. It had become a matter discussed in state legislatures, federal offices, and mining camps scattered across their territory. The decisions made during the coming years would determine whether the Cherokee Nation could remain where it had lived for generations, or whether the forces gathering around it would carry the nation in a very different direction. During the early 1830s, the debate over native land in the southeastern United States moved steadily from regional disputes into the center of national policy. By this time, the United States had grown significantly in both population and territory. New states continued to form as settlers moved westward, and the political leadership of the country increasingly focused on how expansion would shape the nation's future. The election of Andrew Jackson in 1828 marked an important shift in how the federal government approached native nations living within American borders. Jackson had built his reputation on the frontier, where conflicts between settlers and native communities had long influenced political thinking. His experiences shaped his belief that the continued presence of native nations within the boundaries of American states created persistent tensions. Jackson's view was not formed suddenly during his presidency. It had developed over many years as he observed the expanding frontier and the disputes that often followed settlement. By the time he entered the White House, he already supported the idea that native nations should relocate to lands west of the Mississippi River. From his perspective, such a move could reduce conflict and allow the United States to expand without continuous disputes over land ownership. In Washington, this idea became the basis for a major policy initiative. Jackson and his supporters proposed legislation that would authorize the federal government to negotiate land exchanges with native nations in the East. Under this plan, native nations would give up their lands within existing states and relocate to territories farther west. These western lands were described as permanent homes where native nations could maintain their governments and communities without interference from state authorities. Supporters of the policy presented it as a practical compromise. They argued that relocation could prevent future clashes between settlers and native populations, while providing native nations with land that would remain under their own control. However, the proposal raised serious questions among many observers. Critics pointed out that native nations such as the Cherokee had already signed treaties guaranteeing their land rights. These agreements had been negotiated with the United States government itself, and they promised protection for native territories against intrusion by states or settlers. If the federal government now encouraged relocation, critics asked whether those treaties still carried meaning. Debate over the proposed legislation unfolded in Congress during 1830. Members of both houses discussed the potential consequences of the plan. Some lawmakers supported the policy strongly, believing that removal offered the most realistic way to resolve ongoing land disputes in the southeast. Others expressed concern that relocation might not truly be voluntary. They worried that pressure from state governments and settlers would leave native nations with little practical choice but to accept removal. Despite these objections, the legislation passed. In May 1830, the United States government enacted the Indian Removal Act. The law authorized the president to negotiate treaties that would exchange native lands in the east for lands west of the Mississippi River. Although the language of the act described relocation as voluntary, it provided the federal government with the authority to pursue removal agreements with native nations across the southeast. For many American citizens at the time, the act seemed like a step toward resolving a long-standing political issue. For native nations living in the region, the law created deep uncertainty about the future. The Cherokee Nation responded quickly to the new legislation. Leaders believed strongly that their treaties with the United States should continue protecting their homeland. They had not agreed to relocate, and they intended to defend their rights through legal and political means. Principal Chief John Ross took a central role in organizing this response. Ross and other Cherokee representatives prepared petitions explaining that the Cherokee Nation had adopted a written constitution, established courts and schools, and developed institutions recognized by the United States government. They argued that these developments demonstrated the nation's ability to govern itself responsibly. Their position was clear. The Cherokee people wished to remain on their ancestral land and continue building their society there. At the same time, pressure from the state of Georgia continued to increase. Georgia officials believed that Cherokee land within the state's borders should eventually come under Georgia's control. They passed additional laws attempting to extend state authority into Cherokee territory. These measures limited the Cherokee Nation's ability to enforce its own legal system. One law declared that Cherokee laws would no longer be recognized within Georgia. Another required that non-Cherokee residents of Cherokee territory obtain licenses from the state rather than the Cherokee government. These actions directly challenged Cherokee sovereignty. In response, Cherokee leaders turned to the federal court system. They believed the United States Constitution and earlier treaties supported their claim that the Cherokee Nation remained a distinct political community beyond the jurisdiction of individual states. The case eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, presided over by Chief Justice John Marshall. Marshall and his fellow justices were asked to consider whether Georgia had the authority to impose its laws on Cherokee territory. The case raised important questions about the legal status of native nations and the responsibilities of the federal government toward treaty partners. In 1831, the court issued a decision in the case, known as Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. The justices ruled that the Cherokee Nation did not qualify as a foreign nation under the Constitution and therefore could not bring its case directly before the Supreme Court. This decision disappointed Cherokee leaders who had hoped the court would provide immediate protection for their sovereignty. However, the ruling did not resolve the broader legal questions surrounding Cherokee territory. A second case soon followed. This time, the court examined whether Georgia could enforce its laws within Cherokee land by prosecuting individuals who had remained in the territory without state permission. The case, Worcester v. Georgia, again reached the Supreme Court under the leadership of Chief Justice John Marshall. In 1832, the court issued a decision stating that the Cherokee Nation constituted a distinct political community whose territory could not be governed by the laws of individual states. According to the ruling, only the federal government held authority in relations with native nations. This decision appeared to affirm the Cherokee Nation's legal position. However, the practical impact of the ruling proved complicated. Georgia officials showed little willingness to reverse their policies. Enforcement of state laws within Cherokee territory continued despite the court's decision. Meanwhile, the federal government did not intervene strongly to compel Georgia to comply with the ruling. The situation left the Cherokee Nation in a difficult position. On paper, the Supreme Court had acknowledged the nation's sovereignty. Yet the forces supporting removal, state pressure, settler expansion, and federal policy remained active across the Southeast. Within Cherokee communities, these developments created growing concern. Council meetings addressed both legal strategies and the welfare of citizens living across the territory. Leaders considered how best to protect their people while continuing to assert their rights through diplomacy and law. At the same time, advocates of removal continued negotiating with representatives from several native nations in the region. Their goal was to secure treaties that would exchange eastern lands for new territories west of the Mississippi. For the Cherokee Nation, the question of removal remained unresolved. Most Cherokee citizens supported the position held by Chief John Ross, which rejected relocation and insisted that treaties already guaranteed their right to remain on their homeland. Yet as the early 1830s progressed, political pressure continued building around them. The Indian Removal Act had created a framework for relocation. State governments pressed for control of native land. Settlers continued moving toward the fertile valleys of the Southeast, and the Cherokee Nation stood determined to defend the land it had occupied for generations. The conflict between those positions would soon lead to decisions that shaped the course of the coming decade. After the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, the policy of relocation began moving from political debate into practical action. The law itself did not immediately force native nations to move, but it created a framework through which the federal government could negotiate treaties exchanging eastern lands for territories west of the Mississippi River. For supporters of removal, the next step was to persuade native nations to accept these agreements. The southeastern United States contained several large native nations, whose lands were now surrounded by expanding American states. Among them were the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole peoples, Each nation faced different circumstances, yet all were affected by the same political pressure created by the removal policy. Federal officials began negotiating relocation treaties with these nations soon after the law passed. In some cases, negotiations produced agreements that transferred large areas of land to the United States in exchange for Western territory. These treaties were often presented as voluntary arrangements, though they took place within an atmosphere shaped by increasing pressure from settlers and state governments. For the Cherokee Nation, the situation remained especially complex. Cherokee leaders had already made their position clear. They did not intend to leave their homeland. They believed the treaties signed with the United States during previous decades protected their territory. Those agreements had promised that Cherokee lands would remain secure under federal protection. Principal Chief John Ross continued to represent the Cherokee position in Washington. Ross was careful in how he presented the Cherokee case. He avoided language that might appear confrontational, instead emphasizing legal rights and the peaceful intentions of the Cherokee people. Ross and other Cherokee representatives reminded American officials that the Cherokee Nation had adopted a written constitution, established courts, created schools, and developed a functioning government recognized by the United States. These developments, they argued, demonstrated that the Cherokee people had built a stable society capable of continuing on its ancestral land. At the same time, the political climate surrounding Cherokee territory continued shifting. The state of Georgia maintained its determination to assert control over Cherokee lands within its borders. State laws continued to extend Georgia's authority into the region. Even after the Supreme Court decision in Worcester v. Georgia had declared that state laws should not apply inside Cherokee territory. Despite the court's ruling, Georgia authorities persisted in enforcing their policies. Surveyors began mapping Cherokee land in preparation for distribution to American settlers. Plans developed for a land lottery that would divide Cherokee territory into parcels assigned to citizens of Georgia. For Cherokee communities living across the region, these developments were difficult to ignore. Farmers who had cultivated fields for years now heard that their land might soon be claimed by someone else through a lottery conducted by the state. At the national level, supporters of removal believed the solution remained relocation to the west. They argued that continued resistance by native nations would only prolong disputes between settlers and indigenous communities. In their view, relocation would allow native nations to preserve their cultural identity and lands, where they would not face the same pressure from American expansion. To carry out this policy, the federal government appointed agents responsible for negotiating treaties with native leaders. Some native nations eventually accepted removal agreements. The Choctaw Nation, for example, signed a treaty in 1830 that began the process of relocating Choctaw citizens westward. The move proved difficult and costly, but it marked the first large-scale implementation of the removal policy. These developments increased concern within the Cherokee Nation. Cherokee leaders recognized that removal was no longer only a proposal discussed in political speeches. It had become an active government policy already affecting neighboring native nations. Within Cherokee communities, council meetings addressed the issue repeatedly. Leaders debated how best to respond to the continuing pressure. Many citizens supported the strategy pursued by Chief John Ross, which emphasized legal resistance and diplomatic appeals. Petitions sent to Washington gathered thousands of signatures from Cherokee citizens who expressed their desire to remain on their homeland. These petitions explained that Cherokee people had no wish to relocate west of the Mississippi River. They described the deep connection between Cherokee communities and the land they occupied. Farms, towns, schools, and council houses had been built there over generations. Moving west would require leaving behind everything they had established. However, not every Cherokee leader believed resistance would succeed. A smaller group within the nation began to worry that removal might eventually become unavoidable. They feared that continued refusal could lead to greater hardship if the federal government decided to enforce relocation more aggressively in the future. This disagreement did not divide the Cherokee Nation immediately, but it introduced an important difference of opinion among its leadership. While the majority continued supporting Ross's approach, The minority group believed the Cherokee Nation should consider negotiating the best possible terms for removal before the situation worsened. These discussions remained mostly internal during the early 1830s. For the moment, the official position of the Cherokee government remained firm. The nation intended to remain on its ancestral lands. Meanwhile, events outside Cherokee territory continued shaping the political landscape. American settlement expanded steadily across the southeast. New farms appeared along roads that once served only small communities. Cotton production increased as plantations spread across fertile land. Economic growth in these regions strengthened the demand for additional farmland. Many settlers believed the land held by native nations represented an opportunity waiting to be opened. The discovery of gold in northern Georgia added further urgency to this demand. Prospectors continued working the streams and hills of the region, and the mining camps that had appeared during the gold rush remained active. For Georgia officials, the presence of valuable resources within Cherokee territory reinforced their desire to bring the region fully under state authority. As the early 1830s progressed, the Cherokee Nation continued balancing daily life with growing political uncertainty. Families planted crops each spring and harvested them in autumn. Schools continued teaching children to read both English and Cherokee syllabary. Churches and traditional ceremonies remained part of community life. At the same time, council leaders traveled frequently to Washington to defend Cherokee rights before federal officials. Each trip represented another attempt to secure recognition of treaties that promised the Cherokee Nation could remain where it had lived for generations. The outcome of those efforts remained uncertain. Federal policy now supported removal. State governments pressed for control of native lands. Settlers continued moving closer to Cherokee territory. Within the Cherokee Nation, leaders and citizens alike understood that the coming years would determine whether their homeland could remain secure. The debate was no longer only about law or treaties. It had become a question of whether the promises made in earlier decades would continue guiding American policy, or whether new political decisions would reshape the future of the Cherokee people. By the early 1830s, the struggle over Cherokee land had moved beyond political speeches and state laws into the American legal system. Cherokee leaders increasingly believed that the courts of the United States might provide the clearest path to protecting their nation's rights. The Cherokee government had already attempted diplomacy and petitions. Now they turned to constitutional law. The legal conflict began as the state of Georgia continued passing measures that extended its authority into Cherokee territory. These laws limited the Cherokee Nation's ability to enforce its own government and declared that Cherokee legal authority would no longer apply within the boundaries claimed by the state. Georgia also introduced regulations affecting outsiders who lived among the Cherokee people. One such law required non-Cherokee residents inside Cherokee territory to obtain a license from the state of Georgia. Those who refused could face arrest. This requirement affected missionaries and teachers who had settled in Cherokee communities. Several of these individuals believed that Georgia had no authority to impose its laws within Cherokee territory, since federal treaties recognized the Cherokee Nation as a separate political community. When some missionaries refused to obtain the required state licenses, Georgia authorities arrested them. The situation quickly drew national attention. Advocates for the Cherokee Nation argued that Georgia's actions violated treaties signed with the United States. These agreements had long acknowledged that Cherokee territory lay outside the jurisdiction of individual states. Cherokee leaders decided to challenge Georgia's policies through the federal courts. Principal Chief John Ross supported this approach. Ross believed that the United States Constitution and earlier treaties provided a strong legal basis for defending Cherokee sovereignty. The first major legal case reached the United States Supreme Court in 1831. The Cherokee Nation asked the court to recognize it as a foreign nation under the Constitution, which would allow the tribe to bring its case directly before the Supreme Court. The case became known as Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. At the center of the court stood Chief Justice John Marshall, a figure whose decisions had already shaped American constitutional law for decades. Marshall and the other justices considered the legal status of the Cherokee Nation. Their decision acknowledged that the Cherokee people formed a distinct political society, yet it concluded that the nation did not meet the constitutional definition of a foreign country. Instead, the court described native nations as domestic dependent nations. Because of this classification, the Cherokee Nation could not bring its case directly before the Supreme Court. The ruling disappointed Cherokee leaders. They had hoped the court would immediately block Georgia's actions within their territory. However, the decision did not settle the broader legal question of whether Georgia had the authority to enforce its laws inside Cherokee land. A second case soon brought that question back before the Supreme Court. This time, the issue arose from the prosecution of missionaries who had remained in Cherokee territory without obtaining licenses from the state of Georgia. Their defense argued that Georgia had no legal authority to impose its laws within the Cherokee Nation. The case became known as Worcester versus Georgia. In 1832, the Supreme Court delivered its ruling. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community with its own territory, and that the laws of Georgia had no force within that territory. According to the court, relations with native nations fell under the authority of the federal government rather than individual states. For the Cherokee Nation, the decision appeared to affirm what they had argued all along. Their territory was protected by federal treaties, and state governments could not simply extend their laws into Cherokee land. The ruling carried important legal meaning. It clarified the constitutional relationship between the United States, native nations, and individual states. Yet the practical consequences proved complicated. Georgia officials did not reverse their policies after the decision. The state continued, asserting control over Cherokee territory. Land surveys already underway continued as planned. Meanwhile, the federal government did not take strong action to force Georgia to comply with the court's ruling. President Andrew Jackson remained committed to the broader policy of Indian removal. While Jackson did not openly reject the court's authority, his administration did little to challenge Georgia's ongoing actions. As a result, the Cherokee Nation found itself in a difficult position. Legally, the Supreme Court had acknowledged Cherokee sovereignty. In practice, the policies of the state of Georgia continued moving forward without significant federal intervention. Within Cherokee communities, the court's ruling initially created cautious optimism. Many citizens believed that the highest court in the United States had recognized their rights and that federal authorities would now enforce the decision. However, as months passed and Georgia's policies remained in place, that optimism gradually faded. Cherokee leaders continued presenting petitions and appeals to federal officials. They asked the government to uphold its treaties and enforce the court's ruling. At the same time, pressure on Cherokee land continued growing. Georgia's land lottery plans moved closer to implementation. Surveyors mapped Cherokee territory in preparation for dividing it into parcels that could be distributed to American settlers. This process assumed that Cherokee citizens would eventually be removed from the land altogether. For families living across the Cherokee Nation, the situation created increasing uncertainty. Farmers continued working their fields, though rumors circulated about possible future displacement. Schools and churches continued operating, but discussions in council meetings increasingly focused on political developments outside Cherokee territory. The leadership of Chief John Ross remained committed to resisting removal through lawful means. Ross believed that maintaining a calm and organized approach would strengthen the Cherokee position. At the same time, disagreements within the Cherokee Nation slowly began to emerge. Some leaders worried that legal victories might not translate into real protection if the federal government refused to enforce them. These individuals feared that continued resistance might ultimately leave the Cherokee people unprepared for the consequences of removal. This difference of opinion remained limited during the early 1830s, but it signaled the beginning of deeper debates about the nation's future. For the moment, the official Cherokee position remained unchanged. The Cherokee Nation intended to stay on its homeland. Treaties signed with the United States promised protection for their territory. The Supreme Court had acknowledged their sovereignty. Their leaders continued appealing to federal officials for support. Yet beyond the council grounds of the Cherokee Nation, the political momentum behind removal continued building. State governments pressed for access to native lands. Settlers continued moving toward the fertile valleys of the southeast. And the federal policy established by the Indian Removal Act remained in place. The Cherokee Nation had won an important legal decision, but the broader conflict over land and sovereignty was far from settled. The coming years would reveal how the forces of law, politics, and expansion would interact, and how those forces would ultimately shape the fate of the Cherokee homeland. As the early 1830s continued, the Cherokee Nation faced a situation that was becoming increasingly complicated. Legal victories had not brought the protection many had hoped for, and pressure from outside governments continued building. Within the Cherokee homeland, life carried on in familiar ways, yet political developments beyond its borders were beginning to influence decisions made inside Cherokee councils. The leadership of Principal Chief John Ross remained focused on maintaining Cherokee sovereignty through legal and diplomatic efforts. Ross believed that patience and persistence would eventually persuade the United States government to uphold its treaty obligations. Throughout these years, Cherokee representatives continued traveling to Washington to present their case before federal officials. They submitted petitions explaining that the Cherokee Nation had long honored its agreements with the United States. Their government operated under a written constitution, their courts administered justice, and their citizens participated in an organized political system. These arguments were intended to show that the Cherokee Nation functioned as a stable and lawful society deserving recognition and protection. At the same time, developments inside the state of Georgia moved in a different direction. Georgia officials had already passed laws claiming authority over Cherokee territory. Survey teams had mapped large areas of the region, and preparations for a land lottery were advancing. The lottery would divide Cherokee land into parcels assigned to citizens of Georgia, effectively transferring ownership before the Cherokee people had actually left. For Cherokee families living on farms across the region, the implications of these actions gradually became clearer. Fields that had been cultivated for years now appeared on survey maps prepared by the state. Homes, barns, and orchards stood on land that state officials treated as though it would soon belong to someone else. Despite this pressure, Cherokee communities continued maintaining their daily routines. Farmers planted crops and raised livestock. Children attended schools where they learned reading and writing in both English and the Cherokee syllabary. Churches and traditional gatherings remained important parts of community life. Yet discussions in council meetings increasingly centered on the political choices facing the nation. The majority of Cherokee citizens supported the position held by John Ross. They believed that the nation's treaties and legal victories should be defended through continued diplomatic effort. Ross himself traveled frequently to meet with government officials, hoping to persuade them that the Cherokee Nation should remain where it had long lived. However, a smaller group of leaders within the Cherokee Nation began to question whether this strategy could succeed. These individuals believed that the political environment surrounding Cherokee territory had changed too greatly. They observed that state laws continued expanding across Cherokee land, that federal officials supported the policy of removal, and that settlers continued arriving near the region. Among those who held this view was Major Ridge. Major Ridge had once been a strong supporter of Cherokee resistance to removal. He had fought alongside American forces during earlier conflicts and believed deeply in the strength of the Cherokee Nation. Over time, however, Ridge began to worry that the political momentum behind removal might become impossible to stop. He feared that if the Cherokee Nation continued resisting relocation indefinitely, the federal government might eventually enforce removal under harsher conditions. Ridge and several other leaders concluded that negotiating a treaty might allow the Cherokee people to secure better terms for relocation while they still had the ability to influence the outcome. This perspective placed them in disagreement with the position held by John Ross and the majority of Cherokee citizens. Ross believed that negotiating removal would surrender rights guaranteed by treaty. He argued that accepting relocation would abandon the Cherokee homeland without exhausting every legal and diplomatic option available. The debate between these viewpoints remained largely confined to Cherokee leadership during the early years of the decade. Publicly, the Cherokee government continued presenting a unified position that rejected removal, yet the difference of opinion marked the beginning of a significant internal division. While the Ross faction continued pursuing legal resistance, the smaller group surrounding Major Ridge quietly began discussing whether a negotiated treaty might become necessary. Outside the Cherokee Nation, events continued moving forward. Georgia's land lottery took place in 1832, distributing parcels of Cherokee land to thousands of white settlers. Many of the individuals who received these parcels had never seen the land before. Their claims existed primarily on paper until Cherokee residents actually departed. Nevertheless, the lottery created an expectation that the territory would soon become part of Georgia's settled landscape. Meanwhile, federal officials responsible for Indian affairs continued promoting relocation to western lands. They described the region known as Indian Territory, located in present-day Oklahoma, as a place where native nations could establish new communities beyond the reach of expanding American states. For some native nations, removal had already begun. The Choctaw people had started relocating west after signing a treaty in 1830. Their journey proved difficult, involving long travel routes and significant hardship along the way. News of these challenges reached other native nations in the southeast, including the Cherokee. These reports influenced discussions inside Cherokee councils. Leaders understood that relocation would require moving thousands of people across long distances through unfamiliar regions. Such a journey would involve leaving behind established homes, farms, and towns. Despite these concerns, the pressure surrounding Cherokee territory continued to increase. American settlers who had received land through the Georgia lottery waited for the moment when they could move onto their newly assigned property. State officials continued enforcing laws that limited the authority of the Cherokee government. Within the Cherokee Nation, families tried to maintain stability in their daily lives. Fields were planted each spring as they always had been. Council meetings addressed both local matters and larger political concerns. Schools continued teaching, the Cherokee syllabary developed by Sequoyah. Yet beneath these routines, uncertainty grew. The Cherokee people faced a future shaped by decisions being made far beyond their own towns. Federal policy supported removal. State governments sought control of native land. Settlers expected access to territory that remained occupied. Within the Cherokee Nation itself, leaders now held different views about how to respond. Most citizens still believed their homeland could be protected through law and diplomacy. A smaller group feared that relocation might eventually become unavoidable. These two perspectives would soon shape one of the most consequential decisions in Cherokee history. By the middle of the 1830s, the future of the Cherokee homeland had become the subject of intense negotiation and disagreement. Pressure from the United States government continued to grow, while internal debates within the Cherokee Nation slowly moved toward a critical turning point. Principal Chief John Ross still represented the official position of the Cherokee government. Ross remained committed to the belief that treaties and legal arguments should protect the nation's right to remain on its land. For several years he had traveled repeatedly to Washington, presenting petitions signed by thousands of Cherokee citizens. These petitions explained that the Cherokee people had no desire to relocate west of the Mississippi River. Their towns, farms, and institutions existed in the hills and valleys of the southeast. The land itself formed an important part of Cherokee identity and community life. Ross believed that maintaining a unified front against removal offered the strongest chance of success. However, the political environment surrounding the Cherokee Nation continued changing. Federal officials responsible for carrying out the Indian removal policy became increasingly determined to secure agreements with native nations still living in the southeast. Some of these officials believed that negotiations could succeed if they spoke with Cherokee leaders who were open to discussing relocation. At the same time, the smaller faction of Cherokee leaders who doubted the success of continued resistance began acting more openly. Among them were figures such as Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and their relative Elias Boudinot. These leaders had once supported the broader Cherokee effort to defend their homeland. Over time, however, they had come to believe that the United States government would ultimately enforce removal regardless of legal arguments or court decisions. From their perspective, negotiating a treaty might allow the Cherokee Nation to secure better terms while relocation still remained technically voluntary. Their thinking rested on a practical concern. If the United States eventually decided to remove the Cherokee people by force, the nation might lose the opportunity to negotiate compensation, transportation assistance, and Western land guarantees. This view placed them in direct opposition to the leadership of John Ross. Ross argued that negotiating removal would violate the clear wishes of the Cherokee majority. Thousands of Cherokee citizens had signed petitions declaring their determination to remain on their land. In Ross's view, any treaty accepting removal would lack legitimacy if it did not reflect the decision of the Cherokee Nation as a whole. The disagreement between these groups grew increasingly visible. Supporters of Ross continued organizing petitions and diplomatic missions aimed at defending Cherokee sovereignty. Meanwhile, the smaller faction, later known as the Treaty Party, quietly communicated with federal officials about the possibility of a removal agreement. In 1835, these discussions led to a meeting that would become one of the most controversial events in Cherokee history. Federal representatives invited members of the Treaty Party to negotiate terms for a removal treaty. The meeting took place in the Cherokee town of New Echota, which served as the capital of the Cherokee Nation. New Echota had been established as part of the Cherokee government's effort to develop a centralized political system. The town contained council buildings, government offices, and the printing press used to produce the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper. Despite its importance as the Cherokee capital, the negotiations held there did not involve the full Cherokee government. Principal Chief John Ross was not present at the meeting, and neither were many members of the National Council who supported the policy of resisting removal. Instead, the negotiations involved representatives from the Treaty Party and federal officials tasked with securing an agreement. The result of these discussions became known as the Treaty of New Echota. Under the terms of the treaty, the Cherokee Nation agreed to cede all of its land east of the Mississippi River to the United States. In exchange, the federal government promised land in Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma, along with financial compensation and assistance with relocation. The treaty also established a timeline. Cherokee citizens would have approximately 2 years to relocate voluntarily to the Western Territory before the United States government took further action. For members of the Treaty Party, signing the agreement represented what they believed to be a difficult but necessary decision. They argued that the political reality of the time made removal unavoidable. By negotiating the treaty themselves, they hoped to secure better conditions for the Cherokee people during relocation. However, the treaty immediately faced strong opposition from the majority of the Cherokee Nation. When news of the agreement spread through Cherokee towns, many citizens expressed anger and disbelief. They pointed out that the treaty had been signed without the approval of the Cherokee National Council and without the participation of the Principal Chief. Principal Chief John Ross responded quickly. Ross organized another petition, this time gathering signatures from thousands of Cherokee citizens who rejected the Treaty of New Echota. The petition explained that the signers had no authority to represent the Cherokee Nation and that the agreement did not reflect the will of the people. Ross personally traveled to Washington to present this petition to Congress. He argued that the treaty should not be ratified because it lacked the support of the Cherokee government and the majority of its citizens. Despite these objections, the United States Senate considered the treaty in 1836. Debate among senators reflected the broader national arguments about removal. Some lawmakers believed the treaty offered a practical solution to ongoing disputes in the Southeast. Others questioned whether the agreement truly represented the Cherokee Nation. In the end, the Senate approved the treaty by a narrow margin. The ratification of the Treaty of New Echota transformed the political situation surrounding the Cherokee Nation. From the perspective of the United States government, the agreement now represented a legal commitment. According to its terms, the Cherokee people would relocate west within the specified time period. For the Cherokee Nation, however, the treaty remained deeply controversial. Many citizens continued believing that the agreement had been signed without legitimate authority. They insisted that their petitions rejecting removal should carry greater weight than the signatures placed on the treaty by members of the Treaty Party. Despite these objections, the treaty's timeline began moving forward. Federal officials expected the Cherokee Nation to begin preparing for relocation. Some Cherokee families chose to move west voluntarily during the following months, hoping to establish homes in the new territory before larger migration began. Most Cherokee citizens, however, remained on their land. They believed the treaty still lacked legitimacy and hoped that political pressure or new negotiations might prevent removal altogether. As the deadline for relocation approached, uncertainty spread across Cherokee towns and farms. Families faced difficult choices about whether to prepare for departure or remain where they were. Meanwhile, federal authorities monitored the situation closely. The 2-year period established by the treaty would soon reach its end. When that moment arrived, the United States government would decide how to carry out the policy it had now formally adopted. The consequences of that decision would soon shape the next stage of the Cherokee Nation's history. After the ratification of the Treaty of New Echota in 1836, the political situation surrounding the Cherokee Nation entered a new phase. The treaty had established a clear expectation from the perspective of the United States government. Cherokee citizens would relocate west of the Mississippi River within approximately 2 years. Once that period expired, federal authorities intended to enforce the agreement. For the Cherokee people, however, the situation remained far from settled. Principal Chief John Ross and the majority of Cherokee citizens continued to reject the treaty. They believed it had been signed by individuals who did not possess the authority to represent the nation. Ross's petition to Congress had gathered thousands of signatures opposing the agreement, demonstrating that most Cherokee citizens did not consent to removal. Despite these objections, the Senate's ratification meant that the treaty now carried legal authority within the United States government. The years immediately following the treaty's approval were marked by uncertainty across Cherokee territory. The deadline for voluntary relocation remained 2 years away, and during this period the federal government expected Cherokee families to begin preparing for migration to the west. Some families chose to leave during this time. These early migrants hoped that moving ahead of the larger relocation might allow them to establish homes in the Western Territory under less difficult conditions. Federal officials encouraged voluntary migration by offering assistance with travel expenses and supplies for those willing to relocate early. Yet the majority of Cherokee citizens stayed where they were. Many believed that the treaty might still be overturned through political action. Others hoped that changes in federal leadership or public opinion might alter the course of events before the deadline arrived. Meanwhile, daily life across the Cherokee homeland continued much as it had before. Farmers planted crops in the spring and harvested them in the autumn. Livestock grazed in open fields near family homes. Children attended schools established by missionaries or Cherokee teachers. Council meetings discussed both local matters and the continuing debate over removal. The Cherokee government under John Ross maintained its position that the treaty should not be recognized as legitimate. Ross traveled again to Washington during this period, seeking new opportunities to challenge the treaty or negotiate a different outcome. He explained to federal officials that the majority of Cherokee citizens had not consented to removal and wished to remain on their ancestral land. However, the political environment in Washington remained largely unchanged. The policy established under President Andrew Jackson continued under his successor, Martin Van Buren. The new administration remained committed to carrying out the removal treaties that had been negotiated during Jackson's presidency. Federal officials therefore began preparing for the possibility that many Cherokee citizens would still be living on their land when the treaty deadline expired. At the same time, pressure within the state of Georgia continued increasing. The land lottery conducted earlier had distributed Cherokee territory to thousands of white settlers. Although many of these settlers had not yet moved onto the land they had received, they expected to take possession once the Cherokee people were removed. Some settlers began visiting the parcels assigned to them, surveying the land and making plans for farms or homes they intended to establish in the future. These developments added another layer of tension to life within Cherokee communities. Families living on farms across the region understood that their land had already been assigned to someone else under Georgia's lottery system. Even though they remained in their homes, the knowledge that others expected to claim the same property created growing unease. Within Cherokee councils, leaders discussed how long they could continue resisting removal. The Treaty Party, led by figures such as Major Ridge and his son John Ridge, remained convinced that relocation would eventually occur. Members of this group believed the treaty should now be honoured so that the Cherokee people could focus on rebuilding their communities in the West. The majority of Cherokee citizens, however, still supported the leadership of John Ross. Ross continued advocating patience and legal resistance. He encouraged Cherokee families to remain calm and maintain their communities while political efforts continued. For many Cherokee citizens, the decision to stay was not only political but personal. Their homes had been built over generations. Fields had been cleared and cultivated year after year. Orchards produced fruit, and family cemeteries marked the resting places of ancestors. Leaving such places would require abandoning much more than land alone. As the 2-year deadline approached, federal officials monitored the situation closely. Reports indicated that only a small portion of the Cherokee population had relocated voluntarily. Most citizens still remained across the hills and valleys of the southeast. This meant that when the treaty's deadline expired, thousands of Cherokee people would still be living on land. The United States government now considered ceded territory. President Martin Van Buren and federal authorities began considering how to carry out the treaty's provisions under these circumstances. The responsibility for implementing removal would fall to the United States Army. Military leaders were instructed to prepare for an operation that would gather Cherokee citizens still living in the region and transport them westward to the territory designated for their relocation. These preparations remained largely unseen by Cherokee communities during the final months before the deadline. Families continued tending crops and maintaining their homes. Schools remained open. Churches and community gatherings continued as they had for many years. Yet beyond the quiet routines of everyday life, plans were forming that would soon bring dramatic change to the Cherokee homeland. The treaty's deadline drew closer with each passing season. When that moment arrived in the spring of 1838, the federal government would act on the authority it believed the treaty provided. By the spring of 1838, the deadline established by the Treaty of New Echota had passed. The United States government now considered the Cherokee Nation's land east of the Mississippi River to be territory that had been formally ceded. Yet most Cherokee citizens still lived across the hills and valleys where their towns and farms had stood for generations. Federal officials concluded that voluntary migration had not achieved the relocation envisioned by the treaty. Only a small number of Cherokee families had moved west on their own. The majority remained in their homes, continuing daily routines while hoping that circumstances might still change. At this point, the responsibility for enforcing the treaty shifted from political negotiation to military organization. President Martin Van Buren authorized the United States Army to oversee the removal of the Cherokee people. The government's objective was to gather Cherokee citizens living in the southeastern states and transport them to Indian Territory in the west. To carry out this task, command of the operation was assigned to Winfield Scott. General Scott was a senior officer in the U.S. Army with experience in large-scale military organization. His assignment required planning an operation that would involve thousands of people spread across a wide region that included parts of Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama. Scott issued orders to military units and state militias, instructing them to move into Cherokee territory and begin gathering residents for relocation. These preparations took shape during the early months of 1838. Soldiers established positions near Cherokee communities across the region. Military detachments moved along roads connecting towns and settlements, preparing to carry out the removal orders when directed. General Scott also issued a proclamation intended for the Cherokee people. In this announcement, he explained that the federal government now required them to relocate west according to the treaty. The statement advised Cherokee citizens to cooperate with the soldiers and prepare for the journey ahead. Despite the formal language of the proclamation, the reality of the situation soon became visible in Cherokee towns. During the late spring of 1838, soldiers began moving from community to community, carrying out orders to gather Cherokee residents. Families were instructed to leave their homes and assemble at designated collection points. These locations included temporary camps and stockades constructed for the purpose of holding large numbers of people until transportation west could be arranged. The process unfolded across a wide landscape. Small groups of soldiers travelled along rural paths and farm roads leading to Cherokee homes. In some places, entire communities were gathered together within a single day. In others, families living in scattered farmsteads were brought together gradually as soldiers moved through the countryside. For Cherokee residents, the experience marked a sudden and dramatic shift from the routines that had defined daily life. Fields stood partly cultivated as spring planting seasons were interrupted. Homes containing household goods and personal belongings were left behind. Livestock remained on farms that families could no longer tend. Some Cherokee families attempted to carry essential items with them when they were gathered. Blankets, tools, cooking utensils, and small possessions were packed quickly before departing homes that many believed they might never see again. The soldiers overseeing the process operated under orders to complete the relocation efficiently. Their role was to gather Cherokee citizens and escort them to the temporary camps where the next stage of the operation would take place. These camps were established at several locations throughout the region. Stockades constructed from wooden posts surrounded many of them, forming enclosed areas capable of holding large numbers of people. Thousands of Cherokee citizens were brought into these camps during the early summer of 1838. Inside the stockades, families waited, while federal officials organized transportation for the long journey west. The camps were not designed for extended residence, and conditions quickly became difficult as large numbers of people arrived. The summer climate in the southeast brought heat and humidity that affected those gathered in the camps. Limited shelter and crowded conditions made daily life uncomfortable for many of the people waiting there. Supplies of food and water had to be delivered regularly to support the growing population inside the stockades. Military officers and government agents worked to manage these logistics while preparing the next stage of the relocation. Principal Chief John Ross also became involved during this time. Ross had continued opposing removal until the final moment, but once the roundup began, he focused on assisting his people as they faced the coming journey. Federal authorities allowed Ross and other Cherokee leaders to help organize aspects of the migration in hopes of making the process more manageable. This arrangement eventually led to a change in how the relocation would proceed. The initial plan had been to transport large numbers of Cherokee citizens westward by riverboats during the summer months. However, illness began spreading in the crowded camps, and concerns arose that moving people during the hottest part of the year could lead to even greater hardship. In response, the government agreed to allow Cherokee leaders to organize many of the migration groups themselves once the weather improved later in the year. Until that time, thousands of Cherokee citizens remained in the temporary camps scattered across the southeast. For families who had lived for generations in their towns and farms, the experience of confinement within the stockades represented a profound change. Children who had attended schools in Cherokee communities now spent their days waiting inside crowded camps. Farmers who had once worked fields from sunrise to sunset found themselves without land to tend. Community leaders continued speaking with government officials about how the migration would be arranged. They discussed routes west, transportation methods, and the supplies needed for the long journey ahead. Meanwhile, the landscape beyond the camps remained largely unchanged. Forests still covered the mountains of northern Georgia and Tennessee. Rivers continued flowing through valleys where Cherokee towns had stood for generations. Fields that had once produced crops remained quiet during the growing season. Yet the people who had lived among those fields and forests were now gathered behind wooden stockades awaiting relocation. The stage was set for a journey that would carry thousands of Cherokee citizens across hundreds of miles toward the western territory designated for their new homes. That journey would begin later in the year, when cooler weather arrived and the migration could proceed under the supervision of both federal authorities and Cherokee leaders. The path they would follow would stretch across several states and through landscapes unfamiliar to many of the travelers. Over time, the memory of that path would become known by a name reflecting the hardship experienced along its length. But in the summer of 1838, the journey had not yet begun. For the moment, thousands of Cherokee men, women and children waited inside the temporary camps, preparing for a migration that would soon reshape the course of their nation's history. During the summer of 1838, thousands of Cherokee citizens remained inside the temporary detention camps established across the southeastern United States. These camps had been created as holding points while federal authorities prepared the long migration westward. Soldiers and government agents supervised the camps, but much of the daily organization gradually involved Cherokee leaders themselves. The largest concentration of camps stood in Tennessee, particularly around the area of present-day Chattanooga. Other stockades existed in northern Georgia, western North Carolina, and parts of Alabama. Together, they held an estimated 16,000 Cherokee men, women, and children. Most of the camps had been constructed quickly. Wooden posts formed walls around the enclosures, creating stockades large enough to hold hundreds or even thousands of people. Inside the fenced areas, shelter was limited. Some people had tents or simple wooden structures, while others relied on blankets or makeshift coverings to protect themselves from the elements. The summer weather added difficulty to life in the camps. Heat and humidity were common across the region during those months. Crowded conditions made it difficult to maintain sanitation, and the limited facilities struggled to support the large number of people gathered there. Water and food supplies had to be brought in regularly, and the logistics of feeding thousands of individuals presented ongoing challenges. Government agents responsible for managing supplies attempted to distribute rations of cornmeal, meat, and other basic food items. These provisions were intended to sustain the Cherokee population while the federal government finalized plans for the westward migration. Yet even with these efforts, conditions in the camps were far from comfortable. Many Cherokee citizens had been gathered with little time to prepare for leaving their homes. Families often arrived carrying only a few belongings that they had managed to gather quickly. Household goods, farming equipment, and personal possessions remained behind in the houses they had been forced to abandon. For older members of the community, the transition from home life to confinement within the camps proved particularly difficult. Many had spent decades farming the same land, participating in local councils, and maintaining the routines that defined their communities. Children also faced sudden changes. Only weeks earlier, many had been attending schools in Cherokee towns or learning daily tasks within their families. Now they spent their days inside crowded camps, surrounded by unfamiliar conditions and large numbers of people from other communities. Illness soon became a concern. Crowded environments combined with summer heat created conditions where disease could spread quickly. Government doctors and missionaries attempted to provide assistance, but medical resources remained limited. Reports from the camps described outbreaks of dysentery and other illnesses common in overcrowded environments. Recognizing these difficulties, Cherokee leaders sought ways to reduce suffering among their people. Principal Chief John Ross took an active role in discussions with federal authorities about how the migration should proceed. Ross believed that Cherokee leadership should have a greater role in organizing the relocation itself. The original federal plan had proposed transporting many Cherokee citizens westward by river during the hottest part of the summer. Boats traveling along rivers such as the Tennessee, Ohio, and Mississippi could move large numbers of people more quickly than overland routes. However, Cherokee leaders raised concerns about beginning the journey under such conditions. They argued that traveling during the peak of summer heat could worsen the spread of illness and increase hardship for those already weakened by months of uncertainty and confinement. After negotiations, federal authorities agreed to allow Cherokee leaders to organize many of the migration groups themselves. Under this arrangement, the Cherokee Nation would supervise several detachments that would travel west by land once cooler weather arrived in the autumn. This plan allowed more time for preparations and reduced the risks associated with summer travel. The decision changed the atmosphere within the camps. Instead of immediate departure, Cherokee families now faced several additional weeks of waiting. During this time, leaders worked to organize the people into groups that would eventually travel together along designated routes. Each detachment would include hundreds of individuals traveling under the supervision of both Cherokee conductors and government agents. Supplies such as wagons, livestock, and food provisions needed to be arranged for the long journey ahead. Meanwhile, the camps continued operating through the summer months. Cherokee citizens attempted to maintain a sense of community even within the confined spaces of the stockades. Families cooked meals together using the rations provided. Elders shared stories and knowledge with younger members of the community. Religious gatherings also took place inside some camps. Missionaries who had worked among Cherokee communities before removal continued offering services and support to those waiting for the journey west. Despite these efforts to maintain stability, the emotional weight of the situation remained clear. The Cherokee people knew they would soon begin a migration that would take them far from the land where their communities had existed for generations. Many had little knowledge of the Western Territory where they were expected to settle. Reports from earlier migrants described unfamiliar landscapes and the challenges of establishing new farms and towns in a region different from the Appalachian homeland they had known. For families inside the camps, the weeks of waiting offered time to reflect on the changes unfolding around them. Beyond the wooden walls of the stockades, Cherokee towns still stood in quiet valleys. Fields that had once produced crops remained unattended during the growing season. Homes built by earlier generations now stood empty or awaited new occupants assigned through Georgia's land lottery. These reminders of the past were visible reminders of what the Cherokee people were leaving behind. As the summer progressed toward autumn, preparations for the westward migration gradually reached completion. Routes had been planned across several states. Detachments of travelers were organized into manageable groups. Wagons and livestock were gathered to assist those who would need transportation along the journey. When the weather cooled later in the year, the first detachments would begin traveling west. The route ahead stretched hundreds of miles across unfamiliar terrain. Rivers, hills, and long roads lay between the Cherokee people and the territory where they would attempt to rebuild their nation. When the heat of the southern summer finally began to fade in late 1838, preparations for the westward journey moved from planning into motion. The weeks spent waiting inside the camps had allowed Cherokee leaders and federal officials to organize the people into travel detachments. These groups would begin the long overland migration toward Indian Territory. The decision to delay the journey until autumn had come after discussions between federal authorities and Cherokee leadership. Principal Chief John Ross had argued that beginning the migration during the hottest months would expose already weakened people to greater hardship. By early autumn, temperatures would be cooler and the chances of widespread illness slightly reduced. Under the new arrangement, Cherokee leaders would supervise many of the detachments themselves. Each group consisted of several hundred individuals, including families, elders, and children. Cherokee conductors were appointed to guide the detachments, maintain order, and coordinate with government agents who accompanied the migration. The journey ahead would cover hundreds of miles. Most detachments would travel overland through Tennessee and Kentucky, crossing into Illinois and Missouri before continuing toward Arkansas and the lands designated as Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. The routes followed existing roads where possible, though many sections required travelers to move along rough paths that had seen little heavy traffic before. The first detachments began leaving the camps in early autumn. Wagons carried supplies and transported those unable to walk long distances. Some families owned horses or livestock that accompanied them on the trail. Others relied entirely on the provisions distributed by government agents responsible for supporting the migration. Each detachment moved at a measured pace. Travel usually began early in the morning and continued until late afternoon. At the end of the day, travelers stopped to prepare meals, tend to animals, and rest before continuing the next morning. Campsites were established along the route, often near rivers or streams where water could be obtained. The rhythm of travel gradually replaced the routines of settled life. Before removal, Cherokee families had organized their days around farming, community gatherings, and seasonal cycles tied to the land. On the trail, life became structured by the demands of constant movement. For many travelers, the journey represented their first extended experience outside the southeastern homeland. The Appalachian Mountains and wooded valleys where Cherokee towns had once stood slowly gave way to new landscapes as the detachments moved west. Rivers were crossed by ferry or shallow ford. Roads passed through American towns where residents observed the migration as it passed through. Weather soon became one of the greatest challenges faced by the travelers. Autumn in the region brought unpredictable conditions. Some days were clear and cool, allowing the detachments to travel comfortably across open countryside. Other days brought rain that turned roads into thick mud, slowing wagons and making walking more difficult. Government agents responsible for distributing rations attempted to maintain regular supplies along the route. Cornmeal, meat, and other provisions were issued periodically to sustain the travelers. Even with these supplies, the long distances and constant movement created strain for many members of the migration. Elders who had spent their lives in Cherokee towns sometimes found the daily marches exhausting. Parents carried young children or placed them in wagons when available. Families worked together to care for those who struggled to keep pace with the group. The detachments were not all identical. Some groups travelled more quickly depending on weather, road conditions, and the number of wagons available. Others moved more slowly due to illness or the presence of many elderly travellers. Throughout the journey, Cherokee conductors played an important role in maintaining organisation. They ensured that families remained together, communicated with government agents about supplies, and guided the detachments along the designated routes. Their leadership helped preserve a sense of community during a migration that otherwise might have felt disorienting for many participants. As the detachments moved farther west, colder weather gradually began to appear. By late autumn, nights became increasingly cold across parts of Kentucky and Illinois. Travelers relied on blankets and fires to stay warm in camps set up along the roadside. Some wagons carried additional coverings to protect children and elders during the night. Rain and early frost occasionally complicated travel conditions. Mud created by autumn storms slowed the movement of wagons. Horses and oxen pulling the wagons sometimes struggled on steep or slippery sections of road. These delays extended the time required to complete the journey. Despite these difficulties, the detachments continued moving forward day by day. The migration stretched across many weeks. Some groups required several months to reach their destination, depending on the pace of travel and the conditions encountered along the route. For many Cherokee citizens, the experience of the journey reshaped their understanding of distance and geography. Places that had once existed only as names in government documents now became visible landscapes through which they traveled. Rivers such as the Mississippi marked major milestones along the route. Crossing such waterways represented significant moments in the migration. After crossing the Mississippi River, the detachments entered lands that few Cherokee travelers had previously seen. The terrain began to change again, shifting from wooded regions toward the plains and rolling hills of the Western Territories. Grasslands appeared where dense forests had once surrounded the travelers during the early part of the journey. The distance from the Cherokee homeland now grew unmistakably clear. Behind the travelers lay hundreds of miles of roads connecting towns and valleys where their communities had once flourished. Ahead lay a new territory where the Cherokee Nation would attempt to rebuild its society. Throughout the migration, the detachments maintained communication with federal agents responsible for overseeing the relocation. These officials reported progress to the government while coordinating supplies and transportation where possible. Their records documented the movement of each group as it advanced westward. For the Cherokee people themselves, however, the journey was not merely a logistical operation recorded in official reports. It was a passage from one homeland to another. The familiar landscapes of the southeastern United States slowly disappeared behind them, replaced by the expanding horizon of the Western Territory. By the time the first detachments approached the boundaries of Indian Territory, the journey had already reshaped the lives of thousands of Cherokee citizens. The migration had carried them across rivers, mountains, and plains that many had never expected to see. Yet the journey itself was not the end of the story. Ahead waited the challenge of rebuilding towns, farms, and institutions in a new land where the Cherokee Nation would attempt to continue its history. As the detachments continued moving west during the autumn and early winter of 1838, the realities of the long journey became more visible with each passing week. The migration was not a single column of travellers, but a series of organised groups spread across different routes. Each detachment carried hundreds of Cherokee citizens along roads that stretched across several states. The distance itself was one of the most difficult elements of the journey. For families who had rarely travelled far beyond their local communities, walking hundreds of miles required both physical endurance and careful organisation. Each day followed a pattern shaped by the necessities of travel. The detachments began moving early in the morning, when cooler air made walking easier. Wagons carrying supplies and the most vulnerable travellers followed behind. Throughout the day, the groups advanced steadily along the road. Children often walked beside their parents. Elders sometimes rode in wagons when space allowed, though many still walked long distances when wagons were filled with supplies or younger passengers. Families remained close to one another, supporting those who struggled to keep pace. As evening approached, the detachment stopped to establish camps along the roadside. These temporary camps became small communities for the night. Fires were built for warmth and cooking. Rations distributed by government agents were prepared into simple meals, usually consisting of cornmeal and meat when available. The next morning the process began again. Over time, the constant movement created a rhythm that shaped the days of those travelling west. Roads passed through American towns, where local residents sometimes gathered to observe the migration as it passed. The sight of large groups of travellers accompanied by wagons and livestock drew attention wherever the detachments moved. Weather conditions varied greatly along the route. Some weeks brought clear skies and moderate temperatures that made travel manageable. At other times, rain turned the roads into thick mud. Wagons became difficult to pull, and travellers sometimes struggled to maintain their footing along slippery paths. Cold weather gradually arrived as the season moved toward winter. By late autumn, nights had grown colder across Kentucky, Illinois, and Missouri. Travellers relied heavily on blankets and fires to remain warm during overnight camps. The ability to maintain dry clothing and bedding became important as temperatures continued dropping. These changing conditions affected different members of the migration in different ways. Children often adapted quickly to the routines of travel, though the long distances could still exhaust them. Parents worked constantly to care for younger family members while also managing the demands of the journey. Older members of the community faced greater challenges. Many elders had spent decades living in Cherokee towns, where daily life followed familiar patterns shaped by farming and community gatherings. The sudden requirement to travel long distances over unfamiliar terrain placed heavy demands on their strength. Throughout the migration, Cherokee conductors remained responsible for organizing the detachments. These leaders coordinated with federal agents to ensure that supplies were delivered and that the groups remained on the correct routes. Their work helped maintain order among travellers who might otherwise have become scattered across unfamiliar roads. Principal Chief John Ross also travelled west with one of the detachments after joining his people during the relocation. Ross continued working to assist Cherokee citizens throughout the journey, helping organize travel arrangements and maintain communication with federal authorities. The migration required crossing several major rivers along the way. One of the most significant was the Mississippi River. Reaching the river marked an important milestone for many travelers. Ferries carried wagons, livestock and passengers across the wide waterway, transporting the detachments into lands farther west. Once beyond the Mississippi, the landscape gradually began to change. The dense forests and mountain valleys of the southeastern homeland gave way to broader plains and open countryside. Grasslands appeared where thick woodland had once surrounded the travellers earlier in the journey. For many Cherokee citizens, these landscapes felt unfamiliar. Their homeland in the Appalachian region had been defined by wooded hills, rivers, and fertile valleys suitable for farming. The new terrain looked different, and many travellers wondered how their communities would adapt once they reached the territory where they were expected to settle. Despite the challenges of distance and weather, the detachments continued moving steadily forward. Government records tracked the progress of each group as it advanced westward. These reports noted travel distances, supply deliveries, and the general condition of the travellers. For the Cherokee people themselves, the experience of the journey carried a different meaning. The migration represented the physical separation from the homeland that had supported their communities for generations. Each mile travelled placed greater distance between the travellers and the towns, farms, and burial grounds they had left behind. Within the detachments, families relied on one another to maintain strength during the journey. Parents encouraged children during long days of walking. Elders shared memories and stories that connected younger members of the community to the history of the Cherokee Nation. These exchanges helped preserve cultural identity, even while the people moved through unfamiliar territory. By the time the detachments reached the Western Territories near present-day Arkansas and Oklahoma, the migration had already lasted several months. Travelers who had left the camps in the southeast during early autumn were now approaching the end of their long journey. Ahead lay Indian Territory, the land designated by the United States government as the new home for the Cherokee Nation. The arrival of the detachments there would mark the conclusion of the migration itself. Yet reaching the destination did not immediately resolve the challenges facing the Cherokee people. As the migration continued through the final months of 1838 and into early 1839, the long distances and changing weather conditions placed increasing strain on the travellers. Many detachments had already been on the road for weeks. The combination of daily walking, limited supplies, and exposure to autumn and winter weather gradually affected the health of many Cherokee citizens. Illness became one of the most serious challenges during this stage of the journey. Crowded travel conditions and limited medical care created an environment where disease could spread quickly. Dysentery, pneumonia, and other illnesses common in long migrations began appearing among different detachments along the route. Government doctors and missionaries accompanying some of the groups attempted to provide treatment where possible. However, the resources available to them were limited, and the constant movement of the migration made sustained medical care difficult. For families travelling together, caring for sick relatives became part of daily life on the trail. Parents remained beside children who had grown weak from illness or exhaustion. Older siblings sometimes helped carry younger family members during difficult stretches of the journey. Elders were often given space in wagons when they could no longer walk long distances. The winter weather added further difficulty. As the migration moved farther west and the year approached its end, colder temperatures became common along the roads used by the detachments. Rain and frost occasionally turned the ground hard and slippery during early morning departures. Travellers relied heavily on blankets and fires to remain warm during nighttime camps. Even with these precautions, the cold weather weakened many people who were already struggling with illness or fatigue. Cherokee conductors worked carefully to keep the detachments organised, while allowing time for rest whenever possible. Throughout the journey, the migration continued to pass through American settlements and farmland. Residents of towns along the route sometimes observed the detachments as they passed. Wagons carrying supplies and families moved slowly along roads that had previously been used mainly for local travel. The sight of hundreds of travellers moving westward created a visible reminder of the removal policy that the United States government was now enforcing across the southeast. Within the detachments themselves, the journey created a shared experience among thousands of Cherokee citizens. People from different towns and communities travelled together, often meeting relatives or acquaintances from other regions of the Cherokee Nation. These interactions helped maintain a sense of connection among travellers who had once lived many miles apart. Despite these moments of community, the difficulties of the journey could not be ignored. Some travellers did not survive the migration. Illness and exhaustion took a toll on individuals who had already endured months of uncertainty in the detention camps before the journey began. When deaths occurred along the route, the detachments paused briefly so that families could bury their relatives before continuing westward. These moments left lasting memories among those who experienced them. The Cherokee language later came to describe the migration with a phrase reflecting the sorrow associated with these losses. In English, that phrase would eventually be translated as the Trail of Tears. The name did not arise immediately during the journey itself. Instead, it developed gradually as survivors reflected on the events of the migration and the hardships faced along the road. The term captured the emotional weight of the experience for many Cherokee families. It referred not only to the distance travelled, but also to the lives affected by the journey and the communities that had been separated from their ancestral land. Principal Chief John Ross remained involved throughout the migration. Ross travelled with one of the detachments and continued assisting Cherokee citizens as they approached the Western Territories. His role during the journey included coordinating with government agents and helping maintain communication between the different travel groups. As the winter months progressed, the detachments gradually approached the region designated as Indian Territory. Crossing into this new territory marked the final stage of the migration. The land that awaited them was different from the mountains and forests of the southeastern homeland. Open plains and rolling hills replaced the wooded valleys where Cherokee towns had once stood. Rivers still flowed through the land, but the geography and climate differed from what many travellers had known for most of their lives. The arrival of the detachments in Indian Territory occurred over several months. Groups that had departed the southeast earlier reached the destination sooner, while others continued travelling through winter weather before arriving during early 1839. By the time the final detachments reached the Western Territory, the migration had carried thousands of Cherokee citizens across hundreds of miles. For many families, the journey represented the longest and most difficult experience they had ever faced. Behind them lay the homeland where Cherokee communities had existed for generations. Ahead lay the challenge of establishing new towns, farms, and institutions in a land that would now become the centre of Cherokee life. By early 1839, the final detachments of Cherokee travellers reached the territory designated by the United States government as their new homeland. This region lay west of the Mississippi River in what was then called Indian Territory, an area that would later become part of the state of Oklahoma. The arrival of the Cherokee people in this territory did not occur all at once. Different detachments reached the region over a span of weeks and months depending on the routes they had taken and the conditions they had encountered along the way. For many travellers, the moment of arrival marked the end of a journey that had lasted several months. The landscape surrounding them looked very different from the mountains and forests of the southeastern homeland they had left behind. Instead of the wooded valleys of Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, the Western Territory presented wide stretches of open land, rolling hills, and long rivers crossing the plains. These differences were immediately noticeable. The Cherokee people had long lived in an environment shaped by the Appalachian Mountains and dense forests. Farming methods, building materials, and settlement patterns had developed in response to those conditions. Now they faced a region where the climate, soil, and vegetation required new adjustments. Some Cherokee families had already arrived in Indian Territory earlier, after leaving the southeast voluntarily during the years before the forced removal. These earlier migrants had begun establishing small communities and farms in the region. When the larger detachments arrived in 1839, they joined these earlier settlers. Together they faced the task of rebuilding their nation. The first priority for many families involved securing shelter. Temporary camps were established while individuals and families looked for suitable places to build homes. Wagons that had carried supplies during the migration were used to transport materials needed for construction. Logs from nearby forests were cut and assembled into simple houses, similar to those that had existed in the old Cherokee homeland. Though the environment differed, the techniques used to build homes remained familiar to many Cherokee families. Agriculture soon became another focus. Farmers began clearing land and preparing fields where crops could be planted during the coming growing season. Corn remained an important staple, just as it had been in the southeastern homeland. However, the soil and climate of the Western Territory required careful observation before planting. Farmers studied the conditions of the land, learning how rainfall and temperature patterns differed from those in the Appalachian region. Livestock that had survived the long migration also played a role in the early stages of settlement. Cattle, horses, and other animals helped families rebuild their farms and establish new agricultural routines. These animals provided food, labour, and transportation within the developing communities. Meanwhile, Cherokee leaders began re-establishing the political institutions that had once governed the nation in the East. Principal Chief John Ross played a central role in this effort. Ross believed that rebuilding the Cherokee government would provide stability for citizens who had endured months of migration and uncertainty. Councils were organized to discuss laws, land distribution, and the future development of the nation within the new territory. These meetings addressed many practical questions. Where would the new capital be located? How would land be divided among families arriving from different regions of the old homeland? How could schools and community institutions be rebuilt in a land where many resources had yet to be developed? Answers to these questions required cooperation among leaders and citizens alike. The Cherokee Nation had not arrived in an empty landscape. Indian Territory already contained several other native nations that had been relocated west during earlier phases of the removal policy. Among them were the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek nations. Relations between these communities required careful diplomacy. Each nation had its own territory, government, and traditions. Leaders worked to maintain peaceful relationships while establishing clear boundaries between the different nations living in the region. For the Cherokee people, the process of rebuilding also involved restoring cultural life. Schools gradually reopened, teaching children both English and the Cherokee syllabary developed years earlier by Sequoyah. Literacy in the Cherokee language remained an important part of preserving cultural identity during this period of transition. Religious gatherings and traditional ceremonies resumed as communities stabilized. Churches established earlier in the southeastern homeland continued operating in the new territory, while traditional Cherokee practices also remained part of community life. Over time, new towns began forming across the region. These settlements included homes, council buildings, trading posts, and schools. Roads gradually connected the communities, allowing travel and communication across the territory. Despite the progress made in rebuilding, the memory of the migration remained close for many Cherokee citizens. Families remembered the homes they had left behind in the southeast. Fields, rivers, and mountains that had once formed the center of their lives now lay hundreds of miles away. Some Cherokee citizens returned briefly to the old homeland in later years to visit or retrieve possessions left behind during removal. These visits reminded them of the deep connections that had existed between their communities and the land from which they had been displaced. Yet the Cherokee Nation continued adapting to its new environment. The government institutions established before removal were gradually restored. Agricultural production increased as farms expanded. Trade networks developed between Cherokee communities and nearby American settlements. In time, the Western Territory became the center of Cherokee political and cultural life. The nation that had once existed in the southeastern mountains now carried its history forward in a new landscape. The journey known as the Trail of Tears had brought the Cherokee people to this place. During the years that followed the arrival in Indian Territory, the Cherokee Nation gradually rebuilt its political institutions, communities, and economic life. The migration of 1,838 had brought thousands of Cherokee citizens to a new land far from the mountains and valleys of their original homeland. Now the challenge was to transform this unfamiliar territory into a stable place where the nation could continue its history. The process of rebuilding required careful organization. Principal Chief John Ross remained an important figure in guiding the nation during this period. Ross had traveled with his people during the migration and understood the scale of the disruption caused by removal. His focus now turned toward restoring the government structures that had once operated in the Eastern Cherokee Nation. One of the first priorities involved re-establishing the Cherokee national government. Before removal, the Cherokee Nation had adopted a written constitution that created a system with executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Leaders believed that restoring this structure would provide stability and allow the nation to function effectively within its new environment. Council meetings resumed in Indian Territory as leaders debated how to organize communities and distribute land. The Western Territory offered large areas where Cherokee citizens could settle, but the land had to be divided in ways that allowed families to establish farms and towns. Leaders worked to ensure that communities arriving from different regions of the old homeland could rebuild together. New settlements gradually appeared across the territory. Families constructed homes from logs cut in nearby forests, using building methods familiar from the southeastern homeland. Small towns formed around council houses, churches, and trading posts. Roads connecting these settlements allowed people to travel between communities and conduct trade. Agriculture once again became central to daily life. Cherokee farmers cleared land and planted crops that had sustained their communities for generations. Corn remained an important staple, joined by beans, squash, and other foods suited to the climate of the region. Over time, farmers also began experimenting with crops that grew well in the soil of Indian Territory. Livestock raised during the early years of settlement helped families rebuild stable farms capable of supporting larger communities. Trade soon developed between Cherokee settlements and nearby American towns. Merchants traveled through the territory selling tools, cloth, and household goods. Cherokee farmers sold agricultural products and livestock, participating in regional markets that connected Indian Territory to the broader economy of the United States. Education also returned as an important part of Cherokee society. Schools reopened in many communities, teaching children to read and write in both English and the Cherokee syllabary created by Sequoyah. Literacy in the Cherokee language remained a key element of cultural preservation. Teachers and missionaries worked alongside Cherokee educators to establish institutions that could support future generations. Religious life continued to reflect the diversity that had existed before removal. Christian churches operated in many Cherokee towns, while traditional Cherokee practices also remained part of community life. These traditions helped maintain connections to cultural identity during a period of rebuilding and adjustment. Despite the progress made in establishing new communities, the Cherokee Nation also faced internal challenges during these years. One of the most difficult issues involved the lingering division between supporters of the Treaty of New Echota and those who had opposed it. Members of the Treaty Party had signed the agreement that led to the removal of the Cherokee people from their eastern homeland. Many Cherokee citizens believed the treaty had been illegitimate because it had not been approved by the National Council or by the majority of the Cherokee population. After removal, these disagreements did not disappear immediately. Tensions remained between different groups within the Cherokee Nation regarding responsibility for the events that had taken place. Leaders worked carefully to prevent these disagreements from undermining the rebuilding process. Over time, new political agreements helped restore unity within the nation. The Cherokee government continued operating under its constitutional framework, allowing leaders from different communities to participate in decision-making. This structure helped stabilize the nation during a period when many other native communities were also adjusting to life in Indian Territory. The presence of other native nations in the region created additional opportunities for cooperation. The Cherokee Nation shared the territory with the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations. These communities had also experienced removal from their eastern homelands and were now establishing new governments and settlements in the west. Diplomatic relationships developed among these nations. Leaders met to discuss trade, boundaries, and shared concerns about their future within the expanding United States. These discussions contributed to a network of native governments operating within Indian Territory. For many Cherokee citizens, daily life gradually began to resemble the routines that had existed before removal. Families worked farms, children attended school, and council meetings addressed issues affecting the growing settlements. Roads connected towns across the territory, and trading posts supplied goods needed for daily living. Yet the memory of the journey west remained present in the lives of those who had experienced it. Stories about the migration were shared within families and communities. Elders described the roads they had travelled, the rivers they had crossed, and the hardships encountered along the way. In the years that followed the rebuilding of Cherokee communities in Indian Territory, the memory of the migration from the southeast gradually became an important part of the nation's shared history. The journey that had carried thousands of Cherokee citizens across hundreds of miles had ended, but its meaning continued to shape how later generations understood the past. The removal of the Cherokee people during the 1830s represented one of the most significant population movements in the early history of the United States. It had involved decisions made by federal officials, state governments, and political leaders whose policies supported the expansion of American settlement across the Southeast. At the same time, it had affected thousands of Cherokee families whose lives were changed by those decisions. Over time, the name Trail of Tears came to describe the experience of that migration. The phrase reflected the hardship faced during the journey and the losses remembered by those who travelled the long road west. It also served as a reminder of the distance between the Cherokee homeland in the Appalachian region and the new territory where the nation had rebuilt its communities. For the Cherokee people, the memory of the journey became closely connected to their cultural identity. Stories about the migration were shared within families and communities, often passed from elders to younger generations. These accounts preserve details about the roads travelled, the camps along the way, and the determination required to reach the Western Territory where the nation would continue its history. Principal Chief John Ross remained a prominent figure in the years following removal. Ross continued leading the Cherokee government in Indian Territory for many years, guiding the nation through the process of rebuilding its institutions and maintaining relationships with the United States government. Under his leadership, the Cherokee Nation restored many of the structures that had existed before removal. The constitutional government adopted in the eastern homeland was re-established in the Western Territory. Council meetings addressed laws, trade, and land distribution. Schools and churches continued operating within the growing communities. Agriculture expanded as farms developed across the new territory. Cherokee farmers adapted their methods to the conditions of the western landscape. Corn, beans, and other crops remained important sources of food, while livestock contributed to the economic stability of many households. Trade networks also developed between Cherokee settlements and neighboring communities. Merchants traveled through Indian Territory, selling goods and purchasing agricultural products produced by Cherokee farmers. These exchanges connected the Cherokee Nation to the broader economy of the region. Education remained an important part of the nation's cultural life. Schools continued teaching both English and the Cherokee syllabary created by Sequoyah. Literacy in the Cherokee language allowed newspapers, legal documents, and correspondence to circulate among communities throughout the territory. The preservation of language and education helped maintain continuity between the Cherokee homeland of the Southeast and the new settlements established in Indian Territory. For many Cherokee citizens, the process of rebuilding did not erase the memory of the homeland that had been left behind. The mountains, rivers, and valleys of Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina remained part of family history. Stories about towns and farms that once stood there continued to be told long after the migration had ended. These memories created a connection between past and present that remained central to Cherokee identity. Historians later recognized the Trail of Tears as an event that reflected broader policies affecting native nations throughout the United States during the 19th century. The Indian removal policy had relocated several native nations from the southeastern United States to territories west of the Mississippi River. The Cherokee migration became one of the most widely remembered examples because of the large number of people involved and the detailed accounts preserved by those who experienced the journey. Today, the story of the Trail of Tears is remembered through historical records, cultural traditions, and places along the routes travelled by the Cherokee people. Markers and memorials now stand in locations where detachments once passed. These sites help visitors understand the paths taken during the migration and the historical events associated with those routes. The Cherokee Nation itself continues to exist in the region where the migration ended. Communities established in Indian Territory during the 19th century eventually became part of modern Oklahoma. Cherokee citizens today maintain cultural traditions, language programs, schools, and government institutions that connect the present generation with the history of their ancestors. The Trail of Tears therefore represents both a moment of loss and a chapter of endurance. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by political decisions and government policies, but also by the resilience of communities determined to preserve their identity through difficult circumstances. The Cherokee people carried their language, traditions, and institutions across the long road west. In doing so, they ensured that the Cherokee Nation would continue to exist, even after leaving behind the homeland where it had first developed. The story of the Trail of Tears does not end with the final steps of the migration. It continues through the lives of the generations who rebuilt their nation and carried forward the memory of the journey that brought them there. And when we look back at that long path today, we see not only the hardships of the past, but also the persistence of a people whose history did not end when the road reached its final destination. For the Cherokee Nation, the Trail of Tears represented a profound transition from one homeland to another. The journey itself covered many miles, yet the continuity of the Cherokee people carried forward beyond that distance. Communities rebuilt their towns, schools, and farms in the Western Territory. Language and traditions continued guiding everyday life. The Cherokee Nation endured, adapting to a new landscape while preserving connections to the past. As we step away from tonight's story, it becomes clear that history does not simply end when an event concludes. Instead, its meaning continues unfolding in the lives of those who remember it and those who carry its lessons into the future. So for now, allow the mind to drift gently away from the long roads and distant landscapes we have travelled together tonight. The story has reached its quiet resting place, and as the night grows calm around you, let the echoes of history fade softly into the background.